Good morning and welcome to the third Sunday in Lent. Today I'm telling a story which some of the people hearing this sermon have heard several times before, and so I'm not going to tell it in detail, but it was the very best story that I could come up with to talk about today's gospel. The story is about a life-saving station, about how the remembrance and repetition of the life-saving experience and the opportunity to become over and over again a life-saving community ourselves can get codified and complicated in a way that twists the original mission. The people who participate in the ongoing life of the life-saving station forget what brought them together in the first place. They get so involved in the structures and trappings that they actually stop saving lives. This story comes up again and again because the institutional church and maybe even our own parishes are so vulnerable to this kind of loss of focus and mission. The religious establishment in the time of Jesus had the same problem. Today's gospel is not about Jesus having a temper, and it is not about corrupt religious practices. Jesus's whole life was about calling the people of God back to themselves. Somehow, along the way in the life of the people of Israel, the religious establishment, not the Jews, but the church hierarchy, thought that they could safeguard that loving, life-giving encounter they had with the God of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Rachel, Jacob and Leah, the God of the Exodus, the God of deliverance and promise. They thought they could safeguard all of that by codifying an elaborate system of sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. Jesus was not objecting to the specifics of selling animals for sacrifice. In fact, that practice was probably, at least in part, developed to make it possible for poor people who traveled a long way and could not travel with their animals to purchase animals on site for sacrifice. Jesus was not objecting to the money changers. They were doing what they thought God would have wanted, exchanging Roman coinage for local currency that didn't have a graven image of the emperor on it. No, Jesus was objecting to the entire system of temple sacrifice. This story is as if someone came along to that famous life-saving station and dismantled it, maybe came at it with a wrecking ball and tossed the whole thing into the sea and said, "Time to get back to saving lives. I'm going to make it easy for you." When Jesus overturns the tables in the temple, he overturns the whole system. No wonder he gets into so much trouble. He says, "You have it all wrong." Or more accurately, "You are good and faithful people, but you've forgotten about who God is and what God asks of us." God became human in Jesus so that Jesus could call God's beloved people back to themselves, back to the loving God who is eternal and unchanging, but who never sits still. God who intervenes in history in surprising, sometimes inexplicable ways. Jesus came to call God's people back to themselves and to call us back to ourselves. He came to remind the people of God what God taught them through the prophets. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. What God requires is not rams and goats, but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. A true and contrite heart is what the psalmist tells us God wants as a sacrifice. Jesus always calls us back to our spiritual roots. On Ash Wednesday, I talked about being repairers of the breach and about Lent as being a time to clean away the clutter of our lives, our hearts, in order to join with God in the world of justice and reconciliation in the way that Jesus came to do. This is what Jesus is doing in the temple. The elaborate building of the temple, the complicated hierarchical system of temple sacrifice, all of that is the wisdom of the world, to borrow a phrase from today's reading from the letter to the Corinthians. It is the same wisdom of the world that tells us that we are somehow diminished as a church because we don't have a Sunday school, or we don't have other trappings of church that we once had. It is the wisdom of the world that makes us compare ourselves to other churches. It is the wisdom of the world that tells us as individuals that we need to be smarter or richer or thinner or work more or work less. To all of this, Jesus says, no, it's not about that. In fact, all of that gets in the way. As our presiding bishop says, if it's not about love, it's not about God. The presiding bishop may have said to that life-saving station, if you're not about saving lives, you don't need to be here. He wouldn't have said that. Our spiritual roots are planted in love. The fruit of that love is always justice, mercy, generosity, and hope. Jesus's invitation to us is always an invitation to fall in love with God and with one another. It is always the invitation to give love and receive love. Let this be our sacrifice.